There you go. Cool.
All right, if you could all head to your seats, we get started. Okay, next up we have Nikoli Alsman with his thesis, "It's no game, the IOC's need for financial supervision." Let's welcome him to the stage.
It was the early morning of December 25th, 1914, when, along sections of a German-occupied Belgium, familiar silence hung in the air. For weeks, this silence had been broken by the shout of artillery, but on this day, it was Christmas carols and the chopping of fir trees that set the tone for the rest of the morning. Today, unarmed German and British troops met between their bunkers in the no man's land, where they shared gifts of rationed plum pudding, cigarettes, and most famously, of impromptu games of football. Today, the modern Olympic Games offer us a similar opportunity. Even in the midst of violence and hatred, we have the ability to reconcile with our enemies and join in fellowship, if only for one day. According to the Olympic Charter, the goal of Olympism is to place sport at the service of the harmonious development of humankind, with a view towards promoting a peaceful society concerned with the preservation of human dignity. Currently, the International Olympic Committee, or IOC, organizes the Modern Olympic Games, the Youth Olympic Games, and supervises the organization of the Paralympic Games. It has retained its status as an independent, not-for-profit organization by being 100% privately funded and donating 90% of its revenue towards the wider sporting movement. As for the source of these funds, because the Olympics are always among the most watched programs internationally, the years in which they are held, the IOC has been able to make lucrative deals, giving broadcasting and licensing rights to media companies. Prior to the election of President Juan Antonio Samaranch in 1980, the IOC held a firm stance against linking corporate interests with the Games, the fear being that lobbyists might influence the board's impartial decision-making. After recounting their stance, the committee grew its total assets more than 20-fold in just 8 short years. In 2014, NBC bought the broadcasting rights for the Games through 2032, the largest sale in the IOC's history, $8 billion. However, as their gravy train lengthens, the committee has been criticized for allowing personal and corporate interests to supersede their founders' original vision for the Games. The International Olympic Committee must submit itself to the supervision, legal and financial, of the United Nations in order to maximize the cost efficiency and effectiveness of the Olympic Games. This is because the Olympic Games offer important cultural and economic benefits for the entire world, because the IOC in its current status without appropriate oversight has been a detriment to the Games, and finally because the UN is the most qualified entity to supervise the IOC. Since its inception, the Olympic Games have been promoted not just as a celebration of athleticism and the dedication it requires, but also as a means towards uniting and uplifting its participants' countries. This precedent was set by IOC founder and French historian Pierre de Coubertin, who at the turn of the 19th century told a reporter, "When I restored the Olympiads, I was not looking to what was nearby. I was looking toward the far-off future. I wanted to give the world, in an enduring way, an ancient institution whose guiding principle was becoming necessary for its health." Just as the ancient games had united men from all across Greece, Coubertin saw the possibility of uniting men from all across Europe to celebrate a shared passion. It was unity. It was just the idea of sharing that winner's podium with another country, whether you were above or below them being irrelevant. The benefits of today's well-funded Olympics are numerous, but their social impact is particularly well documented. In a BBC Global poll, 18 of 21 countries stated that their performance at the Olympic Games affected national pride a lot by a wide margin. When analyzing the participants of this poll, generally those who polled low were Western first world countries, and those who polled high were third world or developing countries. According to the American Psychological Association, having a strong sense of pride in your country has been shown to in turn increase your personal pride. This is significant for those living in third world countries, as having a strong sense of self-worth is often the driving factor for them to start making changes for themselves and their countrymen. Countries like Kenya, who polled at 91%, can use the platform given to them by the Olympics in order to inspire morale despite their global standings. Even the lowest polling country, England, still marked around 50%, indicating that a significant group and even powerful countries links Olympic representation with national pride. Besides fanning the flames of patriotism within their countries, Olympic athletes have routinely used their platform to inspire change back home. At the 2012 Games, the world watched as race walker Eric Baronado took home the silver medal for his native Guatemala, their first and only medal to date. In his post-podium interview, the Olympiad told reporters, "I hope that this medal will inspire the kids back home to put down guns and knives and pick up a pair of trainers instead." In 2018, Baronado reflected on his post-win wish, saying, "I said that because of the violence that was happening in my country, and I hoped that through my medal, I could show young people that sport is something that can unite hearts and minds, and that sport is something better to turn to than violence." Since then, many children have fallen in love with race walking, many believing that, like Eric Baronado, they can change their life through sport. For the cities who can afford to take the gamble, hosting the Olympics cannot just be a surefire way of boosting your global image, but potentially lucrative as well. A large part of the appeal for cities to host the Olympics has always been to revitalize their tourism industry. This post-Olympic effect has even been able to increase the local economy in cities where tourism was already popular. In their year after hosting the Games, London reported a 12% increase in tourism. Those tourists also spent more, $2.57 billion in June, a 13% increase, and $12.1 billion in the first half of 2013. Even Rio de Janeiro, whose games attracted negative press coverage for environmental and safety concerns, recorded record-breaking tourism numbers their year after hosting. However, while this extra boost in the local economy can be alluring for many, the truth is that, for a city in major debt, a temporary increase in tourism can do very little. And while some cities, like Los Angeles, have seen millions of dollars of profit from this process, others, like Rio, have lost billions, which is discouraging enough for cities to see a steady decline in hosting application numbers since the year 2000. I would argue that this decline is largely a result of the IOC's mismanagement. Unfortunately, the IOC has been unable to fix several problems that routinely stain their credibility. Accusations and convictions of bribery, embezzlement, and shady business practices have plagued the committee for decades, and their inability to properly address these issues, even as new blood has cycled through major positions, is indicative of a problem inherent in the committee's structure. The IOC's lack of integrity affects the public's perception of the Olympic Games. For instance, because the IOC is recognized as a nonprofit, they do not have to pay taxes. And since they are also recognized as a non-governmental organization, autonomous, they do not have to report their financial information in full detail. As a result, their year-end reviews often leave readers with more questions than answers. Among items on their most recent financial review were vague titles, such as Promotion of the Olympic Movement, which received $46 million from 2015 to 2017. The IOC has provided the public with two sub-items under this category: the Olympic Channel, a live stream service for the Games, and Culture and Heritage, which received 87% of that funding. So how exactly does the IOC spend $40 million on culture and heritage? Well, the world may never know, because that is the extent of the info they've given us. Because we're not allowed to have any more info, it's hard for us to know if this or many of the other items that appear in their reviews are worthy of being cut or not. This lack of transparency, while it isn't enough to confirm embezzlement, certainly does very little to assure audiences and investors that the IOC's budget is going towards the Games first and foremost. Besides withholding information from the public, the IOC has also been found to report false financial info. In late 2020, journalist Jens Weinrich leaked a list of 117 bank statements from the IOC dating all the way back to May 26, 2010. These statements were transfers of cash to the Rio 2016 Organizing Committee, totaling around $777 million. The IOC, even after these leaks were reported upon, maintained the fact that they actually gave $1.5 billion of aid to Rio. Even if we ignore the leaked statements, adding up the individual payments to Rio on the IOC's review from that year show that they actually donated $28 million more than they currently report they did. These flub numbers may not be part of some greater cover-up, but it should be clear to everyone that a committee in charge of billions of dollars in annual charitable revenue should not be making errors of this magnitude. Another form of corruption that benefits greatly from the IOC's non-disclosure agreements are the mysterious benefits that its board members receive. Because they are technically volunteers, IOC board members are not eligible to make salaries, but through what is called the perks system, they can make anywhere from $450 to $900 a day when reporting to official Olympic business, even if that business is going to or from a meeting for the entire day. As a result, board members are encouraged to look for every possible opportunity to have a meeting or travel on the company's dime. Those who benefit the most from these current guidelines, though, are the presidents of the IOC, who in the past have made ludicrous requests at the committee's expense. For example, former President Samaranch who, upon being elected, officially changed his title to His Excellency, required white chauffeured limousines and lodging at the highest rated hotels wherever he stayed in the world. He and the presidents after him have also acquired themselves the rights to have an all expenses paid residency at a 5-star hotel in Switzerland that, before costs like spa treatments and food service, cost the IOC around $500,000 every year. However, for some in the Olympic Committee's fold, the money provided to them through the perk system is not enough to fill their deep pockets. As I've mentioned before, convictions of bribery and embezzlement have hit the IOC frequently. And as the all too recent Rio de Janeiro Games have shown us, the IOC's lack of integrity in this regard has the ability to negatively affect the lives of millions of innocent people. The story begins all the way back in 2009, when the IOC opened itself up for hosting applications for the 2016 Games. At the time of the City of Rio's bid, the country of Brazil had been making leaps and bounds out of pulling itself out of its 1999 financial crisis. Bringing back tourism to the country, specifically its crown jewel of Rio de Janeiro, was their next step toward total recovery. Prior to Rio's bid, the country of Brazil had acquired itself the right to host the 2014 World Cup, which spelled disaster for the Games 2 years later. At the beginning of the World Cup, riots and protests spread throughout Brazil, many citing their anger with the amount of public funding that was being siphoned from the people into hosting costs. By the Cup's end, the public's fears were realized when the budget for the Cup that was initially announced to be $11 billion was revealed to be closer to $15 billion, which had no small part to play in the once growing country's new $3.5 billion of debt. As the country buckled, the hosting costs of the Olympics loomed over Rio. And in the aftermath of the World Cup, it was predictable when the IOC announced that the city of Brazil had lost $2 billion from hosting the Olympics. And I would argue that it was predictable enough all the way back in 2009 for the IOC to prevent it from happening in the first place. At the time of the City of Rio's 2008 evaluation, the city received a score of 6.4, a middling number that reflected their very low ratings in the safety and security and infrastructure categories. Its competitors that year, Tokyo and Madrid, both had historically more stable governments, lower crime rates, and previous Olympic gigs under their belts. The IOC even recognized them as the more reliable options, giving them both scores above 8. So what changed the IOC from its initial assessment? Well, during the personal evaluation stage, a time when correspondents are flown out to cities to be booed in person, many were won over by sweet nothings from the Brazilian Board of Tourism. The board presented the committee members with laughably inflated predictions that during the World Cup, native Brazilians would spend around $7.9 billion, and that foreign attendees would spend around $2.6 billion, an eyebrow-raising $4,333 per tourist. They also used the World Cup as a kind of palliative that would fix all of Rio's problems before the Games were set to begin. Because although the city's plans for the Games hinged mostly on future capital, the IOC discarded Rio's menial score after what was decidedly a very high-quality sales pitch. The public's suspicions were confirmed in 2019 when former governor of Rio, Sergio Cabral, admitted to paying around $4 million for votes, which former Olympic Committee president member Arthur Alsman assured him was traditional in the process. Of the 9 board members implicated, 4 had been previously convicted of or investigated for other counts of corruption between the alleged incident and Cabral's confession. Because an at-risk city was granted the rights to host the Games, attendees and athletes were met with inadequate facilities and dangerous streets, which resulted in the robberies of athletes from 4 different Olympic teams during that time. Those who suffered the most, however, were the taxpayers of Rio. After their city announced a state of financial crisis in the wake of the Games, the public funding for healthcare, education, and police were all slashed, the last of which had no small part to play in the next year's 13% increase in murders and 48% increase in street robberies. While in Rio, votes were bought with cash, often gifts are the ways that IOC board members have their backs scratched. For instance, gifts for the 2002 Salt Lake City Games included paying for children's tuition, getting state jobs for family members, and even paying for the plastic surgery of one board member's wife. Currently, less than half of the IOC board are former Olympic athletes, the rest being corporate executives, politicians, and literal royalty, none of which should be hurting for cash. This highlights what many believe to be the real incentive for a lot of IOC volunteers: power. As he reflected on his friendship with former President Samaranch, Olympic associate Andrei Gielfi boasted, "The IOC are truly masters of the universe. When we want something, anything, we get it." As volunteers, men and women being celebrated for their humanitarian efforts, it's disheartening to hear that so many are benefiting from their ulterior motives. allowing the UN to serve as the IOC's financial and legal supervisor would do wonders for their public perception and effectiveness. Under this agreement, the IOC would continue to work as an independent organization, but would give up its ability to perform its own audits and investigations. Because of its current legal status, any investigation into the IOC starts and ends within the organization. Now, I'm sure I don't need to explain how board members would stand to benefit from potentially looking the other way in such cases. In the past, the UN has recognized the IOC as a very important ally, with former Secretary General of the UN, Ban Ki-moon, announcing at a 2009 Olympic Congress that Olympic principles are UN principles, and vice versa. This Congress was actually when the UN announced they would be granting permanent observer status to the IOC, a status which enabled them to be directly involved with the UN's agenda and take part at UN General Assembly meetings. Because of their great rapport with the committee and the fact that they recognize the Olympic Games as being important to their own cause, the UN is arguably more invested in the health of the IOC than any other organization of its size in the world. Therefore, if the UN were given permission to allow its Office of Internal Oversight and Board of Auditors to investigate cases of corruption within the IOC, they would be more motivated to do a thorough job. Besides actively searching for corruption, the board and office could force the IOC to release its financial information in full detail, as is already the case with the UN, and upheld its members to the UN Office of Ethics gift policy. According to this policy, IOC members would now be legally enforced to avoid situations or activities that may reflect adversely on the organization or compromise operations, such as accepting gifts, honors, or favors in connection with official duties that may give rise to a real or apparent conflict of interest as to create an obligation. While it cannot deny any of the committee's future plans due to their continued independence, the UN could be used as a resource by the IOC on how to further cut costs. For example, the IOC could begin providing its board members with concrete salaries for travel expenses after flights, rather than letting them loose with the committee's budget at their fingertips. This change would be in accordance with the UN's booklet on salaries and expenses, which states that travel expenses include a payment of daily subsistence allowance at a rate that is established by the International Civil Service Commission. This DSA is calculated by the standard rate of living within a country, meaning that unless IOC board members are planning on paying out of pocket, they will not be provided with luxury dining or luxury lodging, unless, of course, it is a previously established business expense. One major criticism I often hear of the IOC serving as the IOC's chief financial and legal supervisor would be that the UN itself has had several brushes with corruption in the past. First of all, there is a massive disparity between the amount of accusations and convictions of bribery and embezzlement within the UN and within the IOC. Of the two cases that have hit the UN in the past 30 years, both of them were immediately reported upon by the Board of Auditors and dealt with promptly. Besides all this, because the sub-offices of the UN work completely independently from the organization they are meant to investigate, the only time where the UN being corrupt would affect this situation would be if I had reason to believe that specifically the Office of Internal Affairs or the Board of Auditors were particularly corrupt, which, until they are even accused of being so, I don't really have any reason to. At a 2000 edition of the Laureus World Sports Awards, civil rights leader Nelson Mandela shared his belief that sport has the power to unite people in a way that little else does. It can speak to young people in a language they understand and create hope where once there was only despair. As a language, sport is universally understood. Every man, woman, and child of every culture, age, and background, while they may not play badminton or luge on the weekends, understands and engages in competition. The power of the Olympics to use sport on a global scale to help bridge the gaps between what separates us and build relationships with one another based on respect is something that should not be undermined by the actions of a few. Thank you.
Okay, well done, Nico. Nico has stumbled accidentally into one of the most dangerous panels we've ever had. I call them the Power Quartet. So I'm sorry, this might be rough. On his panel, we have Mrs. Melanie Eloquent, who's completing her 14th year at Veritas Academy. She currently teaches AP American History and Beginning Speech and serves as Dean of Academics and Associate Head for the School of Rhetoric. She attended Stanford University on a debate scholarship and truly enjoys policy questions and the research that surrounds the topics that are presented as part of the Thesis program. And I kid you not, earlier when I told Nico about who was on his panel, he said, well, at least I know Mrs. Eloquent is on my side. So we also have Eli Pickering, who graduated from Georgia Tech with a BS and an MS in Materials Science and Engineering. He spent 20 plus years in high tech, including several roles in startup companies, including VP of Engineering at Fluence Bioengineering and VP of Operations at Illumitex and JP3 Measurement. Now he has joined the Veritas faculty full-time, teaching core science classes and leadership. He's also a snappy dresser. You should check out the blue shoes he's got on tonight. We also have John Hallam, who received his bachelor's degree in Christian Studies from Austin Graduate School of Theology. He's been an educator for 12 years, including the last 9 years at Veritas Academy. He's currently serving as Veritas Academy Assistant Athletic Director. And last and least, we have Graham Donaldson, who graduated from the University of Toronto with an honors BA and from Wycliffe College with an MTS. After teaching abroad in the Netherlands, he and his wife have settled in Austin, Texas, where he's been teaching at Veritas for 10 years. He's a co-host on the hit podcast, Classical Stuff You Should Know, and I was joking about the least thing. All right, so the floor is open.
Okay, great job. This is not a scary panel. They're really nice people. Their thoughts might be jumbled. I don't know. Okay, so much to think about with the Olympics, but I love the Guatemala story. And he was a race walker and won a medal. And so I'm curious, if you don't win a medal, can you use the Olympics as a platform to help back home, or how does that work?
Definitely you can use the Olympics as a platform, and I like that you mentioned it as a platform because I think that more people benefit from the representation that the Olympics provide than actually competing. And a great human interest story about that is Pita Taufatafua, and I want to make sure I'm pronouncing that correctly. He was a judo expert for his tiny island nation of Tonga. And Tonga is a Polynesian island, and it's about 1/10 the population of the city of Austin. And the population is so small, in fact, that the number of athletes to glean from makes it so that Pita has to not only be a judo expert, but he also has to be an Olympic skier. So he was at the 2018 Winter Olympics, and when he was coming out on the opening ceremonies, a time when every country in the world that participates at least is able to show off their flag, show off their competitors, and be seen for the first time in a long time for a lot of these countries. And he represented his island nation in full traditional garb, which got him a lot of Twitter attention. Google searches for his island reached 230 more than the average, or 230 million more than the average that week. And it also resulted in a 13% increase in tourism, which was unprecedented. And most importantly of all, when his island nation of Tonga had a volcanic eruption that completely destroyed their internet access, he was able to start a GoFundMe that raised millions of dollars for his cause. And this was all despite the fact that he got dead last in everything he competed in that year.
Nico, great job. So you mentioned that the United Nations and the IOC often have the same kind of goals in mind on sort of like global macro politics, or their goals are the same. Choosing the host cities often feels like the IOC using that as like a thermostat for maybe bigger political aims, giving it to Athens when they're right before the financial difficulty in Europe, Sochi to try to pacify Russia, Beijing getting it in 2008 after their admittance into the G10 or whatever it is, and then also Rio, and you mentioned Rio. So do you not worry that if the UN gets more control into the IOC, that they are going to just sort of use that more to use the Olympics more as a thermostat for some of their bigger initiatives that they have for these nations?
Well, I would say, first of all, to reference back to my refertatio, because the sub-offices of the United Nations work independently from the main body of the United Nations, what we would see is the Office of Internal Oversight and the Board of Auditors specifically deal with cases of corruption within the IOC, meaning that the board was created to provide external audits to the UN and its funds and programs, so they would serve the same purpose for the IOC. And then the Office of Internal Oversight just allows for objective oversight into the evaluation of its members and inspections into possible areas of corruption. So those don't necessarily have to deal with choosing host cities or anything with the UN agenda leading into the IOC agenda. But one important thing that would allow the IOC to work with the UN and maybe reach that kind of idea that you were talking about would be the IOC could allow itself to take the floor more in UN General Assembly meetings, which is something they have already talked about. A big problem with the IOC picking host countries right now is that a lot of host countries, South America, Rio was the first time a South American country had ever hosted the Olympics, and it was you're right, a big political move because they wanted to say that South America was ready, that they were financially stable enough to host an Olympic Games, and they found out that they were not, and now they are trying to push for instead of personal evaluation stages where people are flown out and potentially bribed, having straight up PowerPoint presentations about potential goals of an Olympic Games at that country. So it would allow for more countries to get a say into the IOC rather than the UN to kind of domineer over the IOC's affairs.
Nico, great job.
Thank you.
Kind of following to that point, the Office of Internal Oversight, do you have examples, and then the other one, I can't remember what that was called. Is there examples where they have taken on this oversight role from an external organization like you're suggesting here? And if so, how did that go?
So currently, the way the UN works is it has those sub-offices and then it has partners. And the IOC is the leading partner of the UN. So there's never been a situation where the UN has absorbed another partner into the Olympic or into the UN's fold. But currently, for actual things that the Office of Internal Oversight does, they issued last year on the UN 426 reports that were investigations, audits, or evaluations of UN members. And another important thing that they provide are recommendations. So they recommended 896 different areas that the UN could save money, and 99% of those were accepted. So allowing the Office of Internal Oversight to take part in the UN, take part in the IOC's agenda could be as simple as a word-for-word agreement because they are so close and being partnered, but it also could lead to a full legal status change of the IOC to a subsidiary of the UN.
Really nice delivery, good job. The first question I have is so after 1980 there were changes the way that they receive funding, the IOC. Do you know where does the majority of that funding come from? Is it high net wealth individuals, or is it companies, or is it from countries?
It's often hard to say because the IOC is so secretive with the way that they get their money. I said earlier in my thesis that the IOC does not have to pay taxes, which is technically true. The US government is actually planning on suing the IOC this year because what the IOC has done for decades now is have its head offices within Switzerland, which has certain tax exemptions, meaning that they don't really have to pay their taxes, but also have sub-offices all throughout the world. And those sub-offices will fill out tax forms as if they are going to be paying taxes to that nation's government, but really what they do is they fall back on the Switzerland head office saying, well, we don't actually have to pay, but we're telling you how much money we have. And as for how much money comes from partnerships and how much comes from broadcasting, we do know that a majority of that comes from broadcasting, and it comes from sponsorships such as Coca-Cola and car companies. And that's to have a well-funded Olympics. That is really the kind of a necessary evil, is to have that corporate interest in with the Olympic Committee.
So you talked about the UN gift policy and how the UN gift policy could be a good model for the IOC to adopt. Can you just tell me a little bit more of the history of the UN gift policy? First question, did the UN always have that policy from the get-go?
As for the history of the UN specifically using it, I am not entirely sure. That was outside of the realm of my research, but what I can tell you is that many governments nationwide, or many governments worldwide, currently have that kind of agreement within their government, to where, you know, taking gifts isn't necessarily an evil, but if those gifts are obviously trying to create some kind of obligation to give another body or another government some kind of financial gain or monetary gain, it's going to be, they're going to get in trouble for it.
That's very helpful. So have there been, do you have case studies or examples of a country that had lots of corruption, adopted the UN gift policy, and it actually ended up working well for them?
So the UN gift policy does not account for the actual countries that are speaking as representatives in the UN. It is more just for the UN as a major organization. So it's.
I'm sorry. I mean, if there have been a country that looked at the UN gift policy and said, "Hey, that's a good idea for us or for an organization that we have in our nation," and they adopted that model. I guess my question is, can the UN gift policy actually reduce corruption if it's implemented in the IOC?
I think the fact that it is legally enforced, meaning that if you are found to have accepted this gift and you are taken to court and it is proven that it was a gift by a jury, that it was something to create an obligation, you would not only lose your job but potentially face jail time. And I think that that is what is really making it an effective tool. Otherwise, it's just words on a paper that members can weasel their way out of if they can somehow claim that, oh, it was a gift for our personal relationship.
Okay, I'm really curious about the declining applications for host cities. Can you elaborate more on why that's happening and potentially how your solution might help increase applications for host cities?
Yes, so that is a huge problem with the IOC right now, and I think it affects more about the state of the Olympic Games than people realize. So first of all, just coming up with your application to potentially host the Olympic Games 7 years later, which is typically how it goes, is extremely expensive. So Chicago actually bid for the 2016 Games. They spent almost $1 billion. Taxpayers are expected to pay that off by 2023. Chicago got 4th place, and they spent all of that money for nothing. And the reason why it costs so much to put together an evaluation is because cities running against each other often vary in influence and economy. So what cities like to do is go far beyond the needed criteria in order to host the games to actually have a chance at getting that. And in a way, the idea is that the IOC likes it when the cities go over budget, because a lot of the way that the IOC gets its money is through broadcasting. So when they hear these huge plans that cities have for the Olympics, where during our opening ceremonies we're going to have Mick Jagger perform, we're going to have these huge fireworks spectacles, they hear, oh, you're going to go over budget, but this is going to make good television. Lots of people are going to watch this, and we're going to be the ones making money off of it. And so cities have gotten wise to this idea that really the games go to whoever is going to go more over budget, because the IOC gets so much money from that. And that decline is so great now that in the most recent election, it was for the 2024 Games. And it was last place, for the first place, it was tied between Paris and LA. And the amount of applications they're getting to host the Olympics is so low that they said, tell you what, whoever gets 2nd place automatically gets the 2028 Games as well, which is a huge problem, because I talked about Rio's issue being the fact that they were, hoping that in the future Rio would still be wealthy enough to host the games without going into financial failure. Not just 7 years, 14 years. 14 years hoping that Los Angeles is going to have enough money to host the games is not a gamble that you want to take, especially when so many people could be affected by it. And I think, to answer your question about how this could possibly benefit that problem, I think that more collaboration with the UN would allow more countries to do those very basic presentations about what their vision is for the Olympic Games within the UN General Assembly. And I think that the UN, with its audit teams and its Office of Internal Oversight, looking for places to cut costs, could even help those cities, those national Olympic committees that are organizing the games, cut down on costs that would allow those cities not to go over budget, which would hopefully bring back more application numbers once people see that it is no longer a trap to host the Olympic Games.
So, kind of one of the thoughts that has been rattling around in my head is, through your presentation, is certainly all the lavish spending by the IOC on its own members and the corruption that's involved in that, the potential for taking bribes, all of these things. If I was a member who is like funding the IOC, I would not like that, and then I would pull my money back from that kind of thing, right? In other words, should they be accountable to the people who are funding them rather than to a general accounting to humanity and mankind, right?
I'm not, correct me if this does not answer your question, but I think that because so much of their funding comes from those corporate interests, we have seen companies pull out of advertising for the Olympics because of human rights violations in China and the recent Olympic Games that were hosted there. So I think in a way they are held accountable to the people who give them money. But the fact that the Olympic Games are kind of an institution, I think that they are counting on the fact that somehow, some way, they will always have the money to host the games and therefore profit from it. But I think they need to wake up and realize that if they keep using their power, that there may not be an Olympic Games that anybody wants to host.
So go ahead. So this is a similar kind of question. You gave us some fantastic details about the games in Brazil, and I really enjoyed that part of the discussion. It seems like Brazil was misrepresenting their ability to actually host the games. It ended up costing them money. But once again, like the cause and effect here is Brazil shooting themselves in the foot, right? So is that just not the risk that a country is going to take if it wants to involve itself in shady practices to bribe the IOC, and the IOC wants to take the money? At the end of the day, it just comes back to hurt Brazil.
I think so many countries that are still applying for the Olympic Games do not expect to make a profit. Some of the countries, or cities, some of the cities that are applying to host the games currently are places like Turkey and China, places that, especially Turkey, probably do not stand to make a huge profit from, but it is worth it for them to, for a nationalist sense, to promote their agenda worldwide. And I think that we see the IOC as a committee that should be able to facilitate countries that might shoot itself in the foot. They should be looking for the problem areas within a country that would say, or a city that would say, oh, you are not fit to host the games. But currently they are not because of things like bribery. They will ignore that if it means some of their members getting a little bit of extra money.
You've laid out very well the corruption with the IOC, the need for some change. At one point, I guess your refudio, sorry, is that you said something like the UN corruption is much less. It was dealt with quickly when there's been corruption within the UN.
Yes.
And my response to that would be, well, wait till you introduce something that brings in hundreds of billions of dollars, right? And so the question is, why do you think the UN would not, with their self-interests, would not succumb to new levels of corruption, given that now they've got oversight over something that members and member countries will be receiving tens of billions of dollars depending on how they interact with it?
Yes, so if I could, I would definitely recommend an organization of the IOC's size that had no history of corruption. But unfortunately, there are none that currently exist. Those two cases that hit the UN both dealt with assembly members. So assembly members of the UN General Assembly, one of them was found to be promoting Chinese interests within his country, Paraguay. So that is something that isn't taking money away from isn't really taking money. It's taking money from an outside interest to promote an agenda. And the only other case was an oil for food program that was held, and this was back in the 90s, and I think it blew over in the 2000s. But an oil for food investigation where, yes, some members of the UN were embezzling funds from a humanitarian effort. But I think that, the fact that the UN General Assembly, which is probably the most corrupt aspect of the UN, needing to go through the Office of Internal Oversight and the Board of Auditors, which are a collection of very well-trained lawyers and investigators, to somehow get money from the IOC would be a very complicated case. I would love to see how they would go about doing that, but I don't think that it's currently something that we would have to worry about.
One more question about the legal cases that you mentioned when cases of corruption are brought against IOC members. It kind of broad swath. If you have one example, like how is that actually the legal action executed? Because a country, let's say that Donaldson represents Canada and he lives in Canada and commits, is accused of taking a bribe in the United States. How does the United States go get Donaldson for that?
Well, I have two great examples of that. So I'll just lump them together for sake of time. But during the Rio 2016 corruption scandal, two members of the IOC in particular were brought to court, and they are brought to Brazilian court because the crime took place in Brazil. So Laman Dijk, he was a member of an international sports federation that is under the IOC. He was sentenced to 4 years for corruption charges for taking bribes. And then that sentence was shortened to 2 years, thanks to IOC lawyers. And then that was shortened to 2 years house arrest, thanks again to the lawyers. And then he got to reside for 2 years in his French mansion in the countryside of France. But a local soccer team paid the $650,000 bail for him to get out of his house arrest. So at the end of the day, he loses nothing other than the job that he was abusing in order to get money. Now, someone else who was accused of this, or convicted, was Pat Hinckley, and he was the head of the Irish Olympic Council, which, even though it is not a part of the IOC main board, they still get a vote in hosting applications. So he faced 44 years for extortion and bribery. Several charges were dropped, and he is now facing, he is currently in a maximum security prison in Brazil. But the IOC, when he was first arrested, paid his $400,000 bail, and they don't expect him to pay that back, or his family to pay that back. And once he gets out, they have made it clear that he was going to be allowed to come back onto the Irish Olympic Committee, but he just won't have a vote. So hopefully the corruption will stop. And he served as the president for 27 years, and this is the first case of corruption that is brought against him. But is that really the first time that he has been corrupt? I don't think so. I don't think that's, you wait 27 years and then you decide to abuse your position. So.
Okay, good job. Well done. All right, we will be back at 6:10. 6:10.
He did so well.